Welcome Winy Maas back to the school. There was a time when, of course, we used to see a lot more of Winy, when he taught for a short bit of time, not too long, but in the graduate design program, in the DRL program, and it was great. Since that time, of course, they were busy then. The practice of MVRDV has gone on to do a number of great projects, many different locations. I think one of the things that makes the practice quite distinct is their insistence on working on research and practice very much simultaneously. When he has often been involved in teaching, not just here at the AA, at the Berlage, in other places. And I think the office has really built on the kind of research side of the work that they've all been doing. Many of these projects have been published, so the work of MVRDV is now available in, I don't know, there must be at least a dozen or so different publications worldwide, so I'm sure many of you would be familiar. Tonight, it's great that Winy is going to give a brand new lecture that hasn't been given. The focus will be more on the relationship of the practice to issues of technology, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Winy Maas.
Okay. Let me take his chair. That's fine. This building is now under construction next to Tokyo, somewhere in the mountains, and one could see that this. Could say that this building is maybe our first building, which is indeed, say, talking about a 3D city or a three-dimensionalized city, to make spaces, public spaces, on different levels, underneath, in the middle, on top. A series of sandwiches which in another continent comes out. But tonight I will not talk about the 3D city. I have been, although I was not at the AA since a while, I've been speaking here in London for a couple of times, assuming that this circuit would be small enough to get some of you there. So normally I don't want to speak more than once a year in a place, because it doesn't give me time almost to bring new subjects further. Or you should dedicate, of course, then a series of lectures to deepen step by step things out. That's what maybe I'm going to do tonight. I'm going to try to talk about actually two books which comes out. One came out last week. I just gave one copy to Mossa. And indeed our series, the space we have besides our buildings to use paper or CDs in the nearby future to make and to show the constraints or the surrounding or the context of our architecture and of our thinking, with a program which makes that we have this 4 books a year, a bookazine made by Akhtar, where now one of these copies comes out actually with another editor. We swap editors, like, in order to find money and to get enough, say, potential everywhere, and to balance out possible, say, market-driven approaches of editors. Anyway, not the 3D city, because that you can see in the nearby future in those books. But I want to talk about a subject which the office at the moment is weirdly so much involved in. As some might say, you can call it a kind of new machine age. Some people say information age. I would rather prefer to use the word machinery, or actually devices. Elements that in a way want to talk about this kind of environments, where they see architecture as a kind of instrument in order to say something about a wider and larger context. To say something not only about itself, not only about form, not only about its interior, but that could be seen as an instrument for an urban context, or wants to have an appel on that wider context. How can you do that? How can you, that way, where the last, say, decades, architecture was or an echo, like in the deconstructivistic time, about the environment, where afterwards numbers of architects worked on, say, analysis of urban environments, for what sake, now gradually moving to maybe the world of constructions again, where we could try to, not to manipulate this endless scenography, this endless sprawl, this enormous wrap around the globe, to deal maybe with the next phase in it. I will do that in, actually on 2 or 3 levels. I go back to it for a moment. I want to introduce, let's say, 2 kind of devices. I give their kind of history on 2 types of scale. Actually, they will be linked in the end, and hope to give them a kind of, say, an introduction in there for a next phase of making. Making in an environment which is so complex, where there are so many issues to deal with, where politics have made it recently even more difficult than ever before, where populism has to be encountered, where economy is driving us crazy, and where only sometimes architecture occurs because of private, say, luxuriism in a way. And if we want to go beyond that privatism, then we have to work with that enormous amount of individualism, that enormous amount of populism, that enormous amount of banalism. It started a year ago, 1.5 years ago, in the Berlage, where I taught for a couple of years, which I'm ending by the end of this year actually, going them to Yale. But I want to finish those series of studies with this, say, series of observations, and finally those books. It's about, in that way, software, about devices that want to talk about architecture, that want to deal with individual input, and that want to make or to show possible outputs, that want to draw conclusions, that want to combine conclusions, that want to compare, that want to store, that want to combine knowledge in a way. Architecture, not only as a kind of avant-garde momentum of artisticity, of this kind of Houdini-like approach, so that we are trained for, always to escape, but that maybe in the end studies escapism. So here, how we could open. No, it has been, and this is a series of questions by the students put forward in that direction on this subject. What is such a device? Why is it? What is it for? When did it already happen? And how can we make this kind of devices? So I will show those series of questions, and I will bounce back to our work. I use some of our buildings to, say, to confront that with this maybe general attitude. Okay, what's such a kind of device? These kind of devices are generally tools. They are both for analysis as for design. That's already something. They want to address not only a specific scale, but actually all scales. It's not only about uncertainty, but it is as well about certainty. It wants to bounce between the two. It's not only for one single solution, but a possible set of solutions, or say intentions. Efficiency can be defined, and therefore codes or comparativeness can be suggested. It bounces between rationality and sometimes even irrationality, on how to position them between. And ultimately, we should and we can develop scores which could mirror criticism and could help criticism, our allies in architectural land. So why are we doing this? And one could say that as the student said, that there was a time that urban issues were more or less, say, covered by this kind of books, series of analysis, which lead to certain knowledge, but didn't lead to the proposals. So how can we go beyond that? How can we quantify that quality? And can we then invent constructions transcending from that kind of information? So where can we use it for, and what kind of things can be in it? It can be both an inventory, by linking all kind of, say, data, and I have been working here in those moments at datascapes as well, and brought forward a kind of, say, technique in order to work with it. And I see a lot of schools at the moment are working with data endlessly without making targets as such. I'm in a way worried about my own, say, proposal as such. But still, an inventory of all those data, GIS-based or any satellite-based, is there. So we have to use it. But we have to actually to swallow it and to go beyond it in order to maintain it and to know how to handle, to deal with it. We should use this kind of devices, this kind of computer programs, this kind of software, and ultimately this kind of buildings as a kind of analysis and a scoring device for existing situations as for future situations. Future situations because we can build scenarios, we can follow trajectories, logics that give maybe give answers. And we can start, and that I think is a crucial momentum after datascape, and say in the world of data, that we could start to optimize elements. A function mixing machine is there, but optimization is a subject which in the world of science not accepted at the moment. So shouldn't we as planners propose that and to combine those kind of analysis with optimizing suggestions? Can we then as well combine it in such a way that we can use it as locators? Where is the best program thinkable? Where should buildings actually be? Where should what kind of program be? And last but not least, we can visualize clearly different, say, strategies, ideologies. We can compare Krier with Eisenman, and we can parameterize them, and we can show how valid they are, and can give the support, therefore, for criticism. This is not the first time in history that this is happening. There's a good show about Mr. Fuller at the moment in Cologne, in Germany, if you would like to see some of his games of globalism as such. There are incredible cartograph patrons from the 50s and the 60s which indicate that kind of knowledge and are echoed in this institute as in other institutes, strongly I would say. We are at the moment collaborating with Jonas Friedman to make indeed a new kind of parameterization of ideologies and to give the social map of the 70s now a kind of virtual momentum as such. And of course Christopher Alexander trying to do his best in the algorithm world as well. Later, maybe finally we got SimCity and other kind of playful attempts. We have to be aware that all we do in the virtual world has to beat this kind of plays. We have to absorb the knowledge. But we have to actually mirror the knowledge. We have to look what they can do and what we can do, and we have to look to its vocabulary, its 19th century, say, styles, and show maybe another kind of style or another kind of, say, proposal. How does it work? This kind of devices. That's what is next hour I'm going to talk about. I will do that in two devices the office at the moment develops. One is on a lower scale, function mixer, and later you'll find the region maker. Two software programs that want to absorb that knowledge and that want to make proposals in a way. The first one is clearly, one would say, kind of a subject that came out of the 3D city, the densification operation the office has been doing the last 10 years in order to advocate that kind of cities mixage seems necessary and vice versa. So how can we give that more meaning? You could say that some of our recent built work were kind of innocent, embryonic attempts to work with that, or to test with that. And the social housing environment, we splitted the houses so that a kind of maximum view lines could be encouraged in between in the blocks. And due to that, the costs were different of these houses, more side facades, and that or we had to compensate with cheap material, with this kind of rubber paint, or to acknowledge it as a kind of expensive houses. So suddenly mixage was there, was parameterized because of the cost, because of its facades, because of this kind of simple rules, but hopefully therefore leading to a kind of optimistic environment where some of them could be literally show their expensiveness, while others would be hidden in this complex, say, parameterization, paradoxical between, say, the size of the block and the typology of the facade. In the Silodam, another building in Amsterdam, we developed that parameterization of mixage in another way. Constructed in the middle of the water, it was a building which, it was actually an urban plan, I could say. This was the whole environment. We designed a dam here with all the parking in it. And these old silos were restored by another architect, and we would do this. On purpose, we made a building which was, during the planning process, flexible. Because we didn't know how much it would cost to make that dam, how much it would cost to make this barrier that surrounds it in order to protect these buildings from oil ships and other heavy goods. We knew that the 90s were good in the Netherlands. We expected that if we would wait with building this building, that we would get more money to make these things. So in those, say in this 7 years this process took, it looked like a kind of, say, that you sometimes put more program here and waited with the expensive program to have the highest cost in the end. We became, in that way, accountants more than architects, one could say. It is, this is the plan. So one could say simple, a kind of parking dike, the old buildings and the new buildings. And this new building would block, of course, this dike. We had a view of 270 degrees, so we punched the dike through the building. The main subject in that time, not only then, but as well because we were dealing with about 4 clients, is that how to maintain all this kind of their desired differentiation. Differentiation was important in that moment in the Netherlands because then you could beat uncertainty. When you have one type of product and the market goes down, then, well, you know it, then the building will not go on. So it was simply a kind of act of survival that we said, okay, let's then maximize your intention. Let's have a maximized number of different housing, but let's cluster them in a kind of mini neighborhoods, not only for social reasons and therefore maintenance reasons, but as well for strategical reasons. So these were some of the clusters from the beginning, next to a double high corridor, around in a kind of garden, next to the water, in a kind of around the kind of patio, etc. Discussions were held in the beginning. What should it look like? Not this. Should it then be in separate towers? No. You know the answer. I explained that before here. No apartheid. no social stratification in the Netherlands. That was not done at that moment. So politically, this is a very social democratic building as such. At the end of the millennium, this is the Dutch mix as it was proposed. We gave them names, and in the process afterwards, 95, I'm talking about a kind of economical fine-tuning due to all this kind of, say, super expensive urban constraints that surround the building were there, that lead to a new configuration. This was the Gauss curve our clients wanted to meet with in typology of housing, in sizes and in economy, which we indeed found by the end of that year in that kind of composition. But what happened in a way is that when these are all the plans, when we simply collaged, finally, in 97, all these elements next to each other, all these changes, that what we didn't know what we would get out of that. But we got this kind of maps out of it. On every floor in black you see another kind of semi-public environment that leads to a kind of public routing or semi-public routing which could give this enterprise not only a kind of mixed appearance or a mixed programming, but as well a kind of social outcome, one vertical neighborhood as such. Here in the detailed drawings, how you can walk then in the middle corridor, go to the facade, go back to the other facade, etc., linked again up, etc., into a series of routings. So this is what you can see at the moment. You come in here at the building, in the main hall, take a stair going up to the stick-out balcony, where the dam in a way is bent through the building. We can walk further along these double high corridors where apartments are on top of each other, go through an interior one, take a stair and go to the next address, which is suddenly open from above, or passing further to houses, kind of villas, which has a double high gallery on the other side, leading to this kind of interior, looking down to the water, where it's actually a harbor that you can meet, bringing back to this environment, or finally again to this exterior. A collision of different, say, prices, different types of housing, and therefore each with their own, say, kind of constraints. When you want to have a kind of less deep house, you can make windows in it like this. You can actually, it becomes cheaper because this is not so expensive. But when you have a deep houses, then the windows become bigger, and suddenly the price, in combination with size, in combination with income, and turn it, or becomes, say, very visible at the moment, or are advocated there. Here's one of the elements, deep houses, so they go over the corridor, go down, you're at the top of the corridor, look to this, or have a kind of the X crossing and through it, as you can read here in this facade, collage together into a kind of new silo of that history of Amsterdam, of mixage as such, as a kind of petrification of that process, not more, not less. Advocating its history, showing it, or marking, therefore, the year 2000 and giving it to the city of Amsterdam. Was the second mixage as such. Primitive, not totally primitive, but a series of experiences grouped together into an observation and finally to a built product. At the moment we are working on a housing expo together with Stephen Hall next to Schiphol Airport, and about 1,000 houses will be there in 2007. It's somewhere in the Netherlands. Actually, it doesn't matter where it is, because everything starts to look pretty much the same in Middle Europe, and I come back to that later. And it's, let's say, somewhere there's the airport, easy to be visited in the end. This is how it looks now. Could be anywhere, as you can see. The only thing is there's no mountains. So this is what I want. Difference. But how much difference? Of course. Economical difference. More than even before. But on the other hand, one could say that individualism has become more apparent in the Netherlands and in other states. There's a bigger desire to escape from this kind of state type of architecture. Can we then, what kind of form should we give to that? And can't we use then the expo to maximize differences? No, let's parameterize it, let's test it in a way. And an expo is actually a balance between, on the one hand, technology, and on the other hand, say, a kind of Walt Disney-like entertainment as such. But can't we use the powers of both in order to activate that difference? So can we not make a kind of new neighborhood which is a consequent series of tests? How to make such a kind of test field somewhere in the Netherlands? Can't we then say objectify that even more? So what we decided is to make a neighborhood, 1,000 houses, which has parameters. We start with 2 parameters. From A till H, architectural parameters we can invent. It can be about cascos, it can be about ecology, it can be about flexibility, it can be about technology. And on the other direction, urbanistic parameters. We can make collective buildings or non-collective buildings. We can talk or make a strip or a street about different densities. We can make a strip about urban flexibilities, which is about pipe work. We can do the same with public spaces or with selling prices. And therefore, we can make such a kind of expo. Every group of house is in a combination of 2 parameters given to 1, 2, 3, 4 architects. And it becomes, say, comparable. If you walk through the street of densities, you know what you can do with a budget of, say, 200,000 euros and under different densities. The same for technology, the same with cascos, the same with brickwork, the same with water. Of course, these fields are not, in the process, not all the same. Some need more attention due to the process, and others less. And actually the city or the environment becomes even more interesting already. We can even, within the plots, differentiate it further. As you will see later, some of the typologies need more narrow space than others. I'll give you 2 examples, 3 examples. One, say, the strip of building systems is heavily important in housing. Do we make it out of brick? Do we make it out of concrete? What kind of prefab concrete? In situ? Do we make it out of wood? So this could be then the whole sequence of building systems to be imagined and to be combined with, because if you do a collective environment, you get this kind of maybe possible tests of different building technologies in one building. Or when you combine it with a floor area ratio, how high can you construct with wood before it falls apart in that way? Or we can do it, here you see the wooden area even more detailed in that strip. Skeletons or not, only trees. What can happen with Scandinavian methods, American methods? Same with glass. Can we make buildings only constructed out of glass? How much can we make out of them? Maybe only 2 or 3 houses, but then still worse to do it and to compare it at that moment with the concrete structures. So and it can go on as well. Of course, here you see the double usage environment. Ideology is like this, but anyway, which at that moment are combined with other kind of programs. Houses under a soccer field, houses combined, peculiar demand in this area, given one of the constraints by the client, is combined with a skiing slope. So you can, from your kitchen directly go into the snow, etc. Leading to this kind of potential, this kind of ecology. How will houses with different ecological features look like when it's only built out of biomass? What will happen then? Only with water. What can you do then? What can you do with different toilet possibilities? Can we use it for other kind of constraints? Here the car wash elements. Can we make kind of twisters? Buildings that want to find the best position towards the sun. So at that moment we already have, by parameterizing simply in this way, we have already quite a lot of differences. Gratuitously, I would say. Not thousands yet. So here the authors come in. So we suggested to have between 100 to 500 authors. That is going down a little bit, I must say that at the moment. But so that it's not only architects there, but as well self-builders or developers or artists involved. How to position them? Imagine that you ask one who's the best to do some kind of crossing point. No, we said let's do it alphabetically. That's easy for the catalog afterwards. That from A till Z in that way. You see some of them. Factories are involved as well. And one of the main things we do at the moment is to design actually the process together with process engineers. And I would mark actually two elements in that way. There's a curatorium, which is an artistic environment which decides about the project, including the economical persons in this curatorium, and there's a facilitatory office. An office that draws, technically, your drawings so that you, Verlieshout, or the artist, or populated Rijs, can make their house in this environment under the art section. So here, how the list is combined with their intention. I'm not sure if Norman wants to make a Houtskelet rijtjeswoning, but anyway, he's on the list at the moment. This would be the plan of that neighborhood as it is now, surrounded with a parking, totally as a pedestrianized environment, categorized in that way, even identified by names, and visible from this tower. And you can see it, it's a restaurant, from your chair you can look to all the houses. Lamps will indicate to the house you're looking at. Webcams will, during the manifestations, be in the interior of the houses. So during the menu you can compare, look what's happening in reality and on the webcam. This is how it can look. This is the facade of this new village. When you go in, you see the ski jump. I'm now in the wood sector. The ski jump tower, the alpine tower for the combination with the 65 plus people, leading to that kind of environment. So, okay, the third step, I would say, in mixage, in parameterizing mixage. But how can you theorize a little bit further? So we did that in the Berlage, in a kind of simple exercise for a city of 1 million inhabitants. We know how big it is when it's in a 2D way, but we can calculate how much is involved for one city when it's Antarctic, when you do everything, you want to solve everything. And what happens then when it's very compact? Can you mix it or not? And how can you do that? So we unravel that by this series of parameters, like leisure, food production, industry, very simply, and look to the reaction of that versus housing or offices. A normal, neutral program. And what happens then? We know how much cubic meters is needed, but what happens with the relationship between the two? Where to position it? There are initial calculations of these different components, how much agriculture they need, these 1 million people, how much energy they need, how much leisure, how much waste, how much water, and in total actually it's not that much. 2 by 2 by 2 kilometers without air. If you then say, okay, this is a detail of that city, let's, which at the moment is traveling through the US, and to test their how reactions on it. So if we test one, in this case, industry on housing, what would happen in that case? This is all the industry, all the manufacturing this city needs. This is how much transport surrounds it, how much employees, how much enterprises, small enterprises are there, and how much service area it needs. This is the total of that industry inventory. But where to position it? That's, I think, the most interesting moment. And it was a moment of weakness as well. I would say, in our discussion, because we couldn't control it. I'll come back to that later. Clusters of industry, that's wise. You need a kind of thresholds, kind of minimum sizes to, for certain kind of elements. You can put them in specific zones, or can we mix them around in such a way that they optimize. There the worst optimization comes in the first time tonight, is that we optimize the distances, the synergy that's in between of them, so that we finally, the aim of such an operation, that the compactization will be realized, beside there's only mixage as such. And maybe a second aim could be then invented, that if you want to have a maximum amount of mix, how to, within this, this moment of economization and synergy, how to have the largest amount of periphery thinkable. I mean, how many facades can we make around these industries so that everyone can still be around? How to enlarge, therefore, the effectivity of mixage. This is if we then take one of those two situations as on the right, and then turn it into the volume, the proper volume. Now at the moment, if we then surround it with all, say, the carpenter shops, all the, say, the servicing part of it, the city would look like this. And actually, that city has some constraints. The current laws ask for a kind of distance between that type of industry and your house. It creates, one could say, a zoning, a three-dimensional zoning in such an environment where you cannot live without enormous protection, without enormous, say, thick walls. So it could create, therefore, a kind of cavities, grottos, which would be interconnected and would surround that kind of industries. A visible relationship would be clearly expressed in this composition. And we did that for a lot of elements. Here the industry one, there you see the leisure, here you see the air, in order to know that kind of components. But we, of course, we were stuck to a certain kind of level. So we brought it one step further in this ballet of the Scapino, a ballet troupe in the Netherlands, in such a kind of environment, a tent with a projection, say, go totally around. I'm not going to emphasize that. It wanted to give a kind of experience for the visitors as well as for the dancers, that they are. How would it be when you are in a city which is around you? But what I want to show tonight is actually what the first suggestions of that kind of how that city would look like. I have to open up some films for that, because it was a kind of background of 10 by 10 by 10 meters. You see here the three screens which are very involved. This is the introduction of that of the ballet. 1 million people living in a kind of normal city. This could be London, two-dimensional, endless. And if we go further, let's get all the things together. You see it coming to you. Point. And let's then sort out all these products invented by the students. Here the colors indicate the different functions, and hops, then we let it absorb by this enterprise. This 2 by 2 by 2 kilometer cube. Up there's there. 1 million people in one block. And we pumped it up for a moment. We were weak, I agreed, to 5 by 5 by 5 in order to, that we were aware that we need more space. But still, say, smaller than the Mount Everest and smaller than Mount Kenya. That for 1 million people. That should work out. We did it for a lot of sectors. I'll give you one of the most demanding sectors in that way, which we, as I already told before in other lectures, that we are so super neglecting as architects, agriculture. Here it is, agriculture in its compactest format, but then without the light it needs. So we sorted it out, as you can see there, the different species that this group of people need. This is a Dutch town, quite a lot of potatoes. And what it needs then is light. Here light comes. Certain species need 2 to 3 hours of light per day so that could cut out valleys in that block, where this species, this is grass, that surrounds at that moment and terraces that valley. A morning valley with grass and such. Same for where the potatoes come, I think, and they need actually light more around 11 till 1 o'clock, more or less in the summer, cutting out from above, wider span, therefore terraces again, etc. Leading to wine valleys, rice valleys, butterfly valleys, well, and if you all count them up, what they need, then here you go, then you could see how much this city is about agriculture. But in a way, Brolacher was not so far from reality as such. But it's actually quite a beautiful city when you're totally surrounded by these elements. Let's go in for a moment. I jump in, here we are. In order to have a kind of feeling how the spaces work. Not very, and not claustrophobic yet, I would say. You can see there's the wine valley. There's the rice valley. Passing by, potato block, etc. The momentum is that this mixage was there. And I want to show that, say that piece, before I want to bring it, say, to theorize it one step further. One could say this was the epilogue of the film, or of the ballet. Here are all the housing projects in it. Then on the, it's very dark, there you see the forest, there you see agriculture. Up, there they go in. Forest goes in. Energy, over there. Industry, presented that already before. Waste, there it goes in. Water is a very nice one there, it's kind of machine. I'm not going to explain it in a moment. Leisure, that's the city, I would say. 5 by 5 kilometers, everything in it, but no neighbors are needed. And here, how that space would look like. Not too claustrophobic as such, but not precise. It has a certain kind of precision with the knowledge we had at that moment, but it's still based on certain kind of hypothesis. Hypothesis, for instance, about light and about the current state of technology. A lot of things were equally dispersed or highly social democratic as such, and in order, because that's a kind of, it's an easy way to show it. But actually, that positioning itself, there are much more methods of positioning. We can follow much more trajectories to combine things or to give an optimum as such. So how can we then, from this product, this 3D city, as it is now touring around, to bring it to a next step as such? How can we theorize that positioning? So, with the Institute and with, say, money from different research institutes in the Netherlands, we could develop this product, the function mixer. As in, to find out what kind of constraints are there, and where to position data, where to position laws and bylaws, what comes out as a kind of optimized suggestion. So it has that way that this program has both a lot of data, simply cubic meters, square meters you can put in, as it has qualities, sliders, as you can see here, and it has scores. And the sliders in a way represent Swiss, Dutch or English laws. And I will explain that later. And there's one frame that shows you your neighborhood, or your city, depends on the scale, you're going to design. So these are that's the build matter. We can decompose them out these are kind of elements, and every object that I think is a core part of the study has characteristics. The floor, the ceiling, the walls, they say something about how you would like to combine it with something else. And that counts for every object. And in that definition, it can find the best relationship and the best position in space. So at that same time, in a short time, millions of options can be checked by this program, leading to the proposal. Users can control it by indicating certain parameters, and therefore the environment changes. More daylight means something like that. More noise means that the program is kind of shifted to other zones. So suddenly we could define, for instance, diversity or noise control or mixage. So that's where the formula of diversity, a kind of fascination I already had 10 years ago for instance, for comfort. Now, and that they brought to the current, say, translation. So these consequences can be monitored directly and can be then applied. I'll show you one application, which we are now, I'm happy, in the office working out. One could say it's the first quartier, the first neighborhood without architects as such. These are the basic parameters in it. It is run now through a series of, say, scenarios within that program, leading to, well, this is not a chosen composition, but this is how, at that very moment, the program optimized the constraints of the client, leaded to this kind of streets. It's connected with the CAD program, and it's directly brought to the contractor, and therefore can be built easily in a short notice. I'm happy, therefore, that we avoid in one neighborhood this kind of personal touch, to look how bad it is, or how good it is, to understand, therefore, or to freeze again the qualities of the process as it was there. I told you already that you can apply this on different scales. You can do that on the level of a house, come back to that later. You can do that on the level of a neighborhood, small city. But it's funny, and even more than that, it's interesting that at the moment different offices like ours are asked to work on regions, to work on larger urban fields. It's at the moment that I would say that the countries in Europe cease to exist. That the Netherlands will be not there in 10 years. There will be no Netherlands Architecture Institute, but a kind of European Architecture Institute. But what will happen then under that kind of environment? And of course you know that discussion between globalists and regionalists. What should we do with that? And how can we maneuver with our regions, with our urban programs, with our architecture in the end, towards these new tendencies? How shall we deal with it? And how shall regions then look like? So in that sense, it's quite understandable that regions now ask to architects to visualize these components, to show what a region can be in 10 or 20 years. That's what we're all doing, I would say, at the moment. But regions have, in Europe, have this kind of tendencies. They're all the center of the universe. They're all the kind of portal to an enormous hinterland, even in Manchester. And they use all the same grammar, the same branding, the same logistics and logics in order to advocate this centrality. Right at the moment that centrality is evaporating, that right at the moment that Europe has two alternatives, or it will become the densest place in the world because of free migration, or dissolves itself in protectionism and the upcoming, say, grey society. Because, as you know from the demography curves, where Europe is not young anymore, it loses therefore its potential, its knowledge, and its vividness because of this demographic routing. So it's an important moment. And we are asked at different institutes in Europe to do that. In Spain, in Catalonia, I'm not going to show that. In Switzerland, I'm not going to show that. In the Netherlands, and in the Ruhrgebiet. The Netherlands has we're involved in a research group which is about 70 people big at the moment, led partly by us, and we're one of the 4 co-directors. and which is intended to research on the future of the Netherlands. The Netherlands have a certain history and planning. Every 10 years they make a nota which describes how the future will be of the Netherlands. So this is nota number 2, this was in the 50s, this is how the Netherlands in the 50s was aiming to look like. This is in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s and 90s, and the end of the century, how it, and what you can see, because it uses this kind of incredible maps. It looks like Stratego, or it looks this kind of war maps in order to negotiate where things should be. Highly not understandable for say normal people, and causing in that way they become useless as an instrument at the moment. So what can we do with that? Can we change the vocabulary? Can we more kind of interactive, accessible instrument, so that, because planning will not be done anymore, as a lot of people already have been said, by states, by nations, but it will be done by road engineers, communities of agricultural entrepreneurs, multinational developers, river designers or water companies, and all kind of new kind of groups, political groups. Those will be the partners in planning. Well, anyway, this whole sequence of, say, Dutch planning, where the Dutch are so famous about, lead to this kind of Dalmatian-like environment, which looks exactly the same as the middle part of England. It looks exactly the same as the north of France. It looks exactly the same as the middle part of Germany, as such. This is what you could do there, and we get this kind of enormous. We get actually two feelings, two intuitions. I use this word on purpose, namely to react upon that kind of element, or we find indeed this kind of instrument to communicate, a communicator, or we do an act of aggression. So we do both at the moment. There are new kind of big plans in the Netherlands appearing, big on the level of Europe, in the end, before it starts to dissolve. Can we then treat some of the European problems in the Netherlands? Can we simply apply for it? Can the Netherlands be the windmill park of Europe? Because you have Denmark at the moment. It has the wrong windmills because they started too early, so they're too expensive. Yeah, excuse me. And so why not dedicating then half of the Netherlands to it? Why don't we do something with the water production for Europe instead of together with Switzerland? Actually, is going to happen. So that's what the first plan will be about. The rivers will be turned from this kind of mini gutters in the landscape to this kind of zones in the near future. And the first project actually already starts next year on that, to scrape away soil, clay of that area, put it on a kind of mini hills, which where you could live upon, and actually the largest water valleys could be found there. This is the first project on that case. Arnhem, somewhere in the east in the Netherlands, forget the name, there's no problem. Oh yeah, Ben is building there. And what is interesting is that in the 60s they made this huge environments around the central city. And when you look at these different maps, this is 1900. River could find its trajectory. And now it's the bottleneck, one of the bottlenecks that causing so much floods problems, and especially in the next 30 years, which has to be solved. So new trajectories have to be positioned. And if you do that, this is the map of Arnhem again, here's the center. This is 50s areas, socially not so good. Let me be straight in that. And we need a kind of mixage in the end. So where due to that, to these new rivers, which next to it, you suddenly get not only an isolation, but a splendid isolation as such. You have more waterfronts, more connection with the water, more with the parks, and that will upgrade that environment. Two kind of islands, Malbergen Island, which we are now developing, and this Park Island will be realized in the coming 10 years. Concentrating all the build program in the city as such, and not advocating its extensions, and say, opening up the potential and combining, say, kind of European aspiration with a local momentum. Second province. Say Belgium, as such. Here is Belgium, and this is a very specific province. I'm born there currently, but I'm allowed to say something about it. But this is what happens. It's the most fast-growing province of the zone of the Netherlands, because it's so connected with the Ruhrgebiet, because it's so connected with Belgium, and becomes actually one giant city. 3 million inhabitants at the moment. How can it deal with it? It has certain kind of issues. I'm only show some of them. This is one of them. They wanted to become the villa area of Europe, of this part of Europe, claiming that they have still a lot of parks in it, and actually the parks are, no one knows them, they're kind of small in it. They want to have such a kind of size. Now actually this would be their ideology. Can we, but it's about makeability, or how can we then do it? So we calculated how much it would cost if you do this whole operation. So to buy whole this province, actually it's not that expensive, 150 billion euros, which is actually more or less like 4 months of hard working in the Netherlands. Then we could buy it if we would spend it only on this. And it's not so. You can do it. That's what we would try to say. But this is more or less the aim of the province, to connect all the parks, to make the parks 5 times as big. The costs are still then reasonable in that way, and they can be paid off by different types of housing in the pay. So, because in the next period 1 million houses have to be built in the Netherlands, the province asks now for 1/3, and then they can pay this off. So that's now the plan. They pay this by this anti-figure, this city of middle density, which will come out of this Brabant city. It will be organized by these 50 mayors, and that's an interesting moment in planning as well. How can you deal with all this diversity? There have been a series of discussions with them in different kind of moments, skeptical momentums here, where they were given, were asked about their ideology, and together with the municipality, and to say what they would like to do, if they could grow or if they want to concentrate upon. That led to an interesting archipelago of desires, which in a way is not bad, because it meant that certain cities would grow to the kind of the mall of this environment. This is 100 kilometers more or less, or some of them would become, say, the kind of iconic ideals of the environment. Others would super concentrate only on storage, and others would only deal with distribution. If that would happen, if you could get these 50 mayors to collaborate, that they choose 2 or 3 issues besides doing all the same, then I would say, you have in a simple way, or in a kind of small format, you have realized what, say, Saskia Sassen or others all advocate for, namely a kind of interdependency that would lead to new balances and that could cope with larger scale. This is one of the municipalities, one of my favorites. These are the inhabitants. This is about 15,000 inhabitants, and in black you see pig stables. About 1 million pigs are living on this surface. So they want to advocate another kind of strategy. I'll come back to that later. They want to have by saying, okay, let's turn it into a header area, a new ring road, which makes intensified farming on these spots thinkable. It becomes a combination of industrial activities with a Fata Morgana in the middle, this kind of environments as such. And it would lead to this new composition of that environment of 50 collaborative municipalities and extremities. Besides that strategy, actually 2 projects came out of that, which have a direct relationship with architecture, don't worry. And one of them is the library, as some of you have seen and might know, and deals with that aspect enormously. It's a project that takes 10 years, so be prepared for long term in the future. But well, as you see here in London as well, or in other provinces or regions, is that a lot of the libraries are positioned in this kind of small, say, barracks. There are a lot of them, and they all have the same collection. All their 50 Gonzalics and no Heinrich Böll. And what do we do that? Do we want to continue with that? Do we still maintain that kind of system, or how can we make a kind of competitive system in the nearby future, where people use more this kind of books, where education is still connected with information and with obtaining information, which deals then with speed as well, with a collection as such. So instead of this, we suggest this at the moment. So to atomize the collection and to combine it and to link them, these two systems, with this kind of issue. So together with an artist, Joost Zwarte, 4 chains of developers are now, say, used or for access of information. Gas stations, town halls, a series of grand cafés, and supermarket chains will occupy and accommodate, say, more or less 500 to 1,000 copies, including the computer, a printer or a fast printer, and an address for distribution. It will be then combined with a central device, and that central device, in a way, will be paid by this operation, because this enormous amount of real estate, which is now, say, positioned all over the province, can actually, in this 7 years and 3 years of construction, can finally accommodate a central library. A library that can therefore not only concentrate on Gonzalic, but can as well enlarge its collection, that it can have Sartre as well in its position, or can update itself, and that therefore can become one of the richest, say, libraries in the Netherlands. You see how we can say, select the books coming out of these libraries and buy extra of them. And then the topic is what we discussed with the librarians. What kind of new kind of librarian system should we then apply? We had this giant discussion, I remember that we shared in the past as well, that how should you do that? You make this kind of children led libraries, the atlases, libraries, etc. So we said, okay, you can, maybe it's the best if you anyway have 3 or 4 copies, that we make one good shelf, 1.5 meter high, and we sort everything from A to Z, so that you can position, say, not only the author by A to Z, but the children's could be under the C section, the new books can be under the N section, the atlases under the A section, etc. And what would happen is then actually a library of about 17 kilometers long, so it's a good walk, and now in a way combines two kind of, say, necessities of a library. On one hand, the promenade, Baudelarian, you need in order to find a book, say, coincidentally, in combination with the searching device. So what kind of shape could give then, say, grandeur to this momentum, can be then make a new kind of public space. You see how it's searching for its shape. We suggested then this silo, the thinnest building thinkable, to put the books in that way, in this kind of shadow between the racks, avoiding the mistakes of the Très Grande Bibliothèque in Paris, leading from A below to Z at the end of the 17-kilometer long walk. Here you see the path coming in. We clad the building at that moment with glass on 2 sides, so that it can become a transparent medium. We could open it up at that moment, at certain moments that we desire bigger spaces, as you see happening at this moment here, for instance, so that their auditoriums or the openings to the outer world could be imagined without, say, problematizing the walk from A to Z. And suggested to have beside, say, the walk, kind of a railroad network of grills on top of it, with about 80 cells, lifts that move vertically and horizontally. So where you could put in your desk, your computer, and your chair, and even your bed, so that you could go from Sartre to the Beauvoir by this organizing principle, by the computer itself, which would lead to a kind of beehive of searchers and researchers in the very heart of this public space, on top of the new, say, a lounge in this province. It will be connected with the highway. It will be positioned, so you have a kind of drive-in situation. It will be positioned on top of one of the TGV stations in this province. There are two of them, so that it will be highly connected and therefore can guarantee its success and can become the icon of their therefore information and of education and of knowledge. You see the TGV running on. Good question. Indeed, you could do that systematically, but in two ways, up and thickening. And I like the thickening the best, to be honest, because then it's cheaper and it makes it in the end into a kind of vast interior domain. But it's fixed for the moment for a number of books. That's a problem always with collections. It's 45,000 square meters, 170 meter high, but due through its thinness, it acquires some monumentalization. This is how it will look in the end in Eindhoven Central Station. No one knows the place, but it's somewhere over there. 10 years to do that process. To have this building as our aim and to start a discussion with all these people, with all the people who live in the villages, the mothers, the fathers, the people who work in the primary schools, and you know the toughness of that kind of debates. You can understand that. The second project that came out of that regionalistic enterprise is Big City, which some of you might know, and which had an enormous, and I didn't expect that, impact at the moment in the media still. As I explained before, in the Netherlands there live about 15 million pigs. That's more the same as the amount of Dutch people. But the circumstances for the pigs are definitely different than from the Dutch. They have to live in this kind of environment, compacter than you even can imagine. But if you calculate it properly, then including all the corn that's needed for the pigs at the moment, and including all the waste and all the nutrients they have to refertilize in that way, then this is, and actually it's concentrated on this Pronkwood forest. Already 1/3 of the Netherlands is dedicated to pigdom. So, but actually we won't have this. You know that there were a lot of crises, not only here but as well on the continent, and they caused a huge amount of diseases and a sincere quest for alternative food processing. The Germans chose for ecological direction, this way, straw, bigger spaces for the pigs, better water, better and diversified food supply. Then the Dutch are at the moment in a way on a kind of crisis, because they want to do this as well, they have to, and they will be forced as well. They don't have space for it, because if the Dutch would do it for this current export product like that, it would mean that we have to dedicate 75% of the Netherlands to Big City, which is fine for me. You can, if you in regionalization is partly about specialization. It's about concentration in order to activate knowledge, in order to do the best thing, and to in order to concentrate in a way, and in the end to encourage trade and this, say, interdependency, as I was explaining before. So why not doing that? But what happens at the moment is that, say, 20% of the pig farmers move to Poland and to Denmark, exchanging windmills in that way, and going to exporting, to reducing our export, and on the other hand, the Dutch are testing with more concentrated environments. So we did a study together with the ministry in order to see, okay, what would be the ultimate, say, compactest environment for our big industry, if in an ecological way, what would happen? So in one of the topics, there are about 4 or 5 of the topics we have to avoid at that moment is transport. The pigs become ill when they are stressed in when lorries have to stop for a traffic light. So which cause this kind of diseases, as you know. So the best would be to concentrate on top of a slaughterhouse. Slaughterhouses need about 40 farms, then they are payable. Let's put them on top of each other. Easily, that's the compactest. As in the exercise, you get this kind of momentum. And at that moment, you could pay off not only the slaughterhouse, but as well a kind of central kitchen. The cuisine for the pigs, which would filter out and would give them the best food. As well, you could create a kind of biogas factory which absorbs all the shit from the pigs and turn it into productive energy. It actually would give an incredible, beautiful 100-meter high crown to this industry, leading it to a kind of proud environment. We need water for the ammonia and for the air filter, which we could as well combine with the kitchen. That sounds contradictory, but that will work out. I'll show that later. And which in a way would already start to activate other kind of food procedure. Ultimately, it could pay even for 20% of the protein needs of the pig. We could deal it with fishes, and tilapia is then the most compact format of it. Salmons need more space. For that, they grow in mud. Therefore, it could be combined with the ammonia filter as such. It's clear that therefore you still need space around for corn, for some water products, but we sincerely reduced it with about 60-70%. But you need outside for biofarming. The spaces need to be bigger for the piglets, and you need outside spaces, more or less 2 hours per day. Pigs should, according to ecological norms, be outside. That you have to combine those kind of balconies with, say, enormous amount of straw, which partly should be built in the building in order to constantly give them the best, say, beds and positions to stroll around. That leads, in the second phase study, to this building, unexpected forms without any desire for designing. It became, as one of the newspapers said, an alternative almost for housing as such. The same kind of, it looked in a way example to one of our housing schemes, I'm not showing tonight, in the Netherlands, where this kind of appearances we are having. This is the slaughterhouse. Oh, that's really well, yeah. A good Parma ham, eh? The Parma ham comes actually from the Netherlands. I'm sorry for the Italians among you, but it's shipped to Italy in order to. On top of it, the farms with the straw. The farms are organized in families, and every kind of villages, African-like villages, with this beautiful golden carpet of straw. And partly mud. You see how all the suck devices are on top of it. How it's combined with the different parts of the families, where the children go, where they go to school, where they have the gatherings, where they are feed, the sex zone. There's some. I'll show you some images of the family life. And how they can find apples, how they can like unroll the straw like toilet paper from the ceiling, and how they can go outside and have a communal watch over the Netherlands. How the transport of say of straw and ammonia is organized along the facades. How the pigs are moved. I think I love to design the elevator. How they will go down after 183.5 days of growing to their final destination, and how an ecological tower can be suggested along the coast of the Netherlands in order to activate the export as easily as possible. This is how Rotterdam could look like. Okay, this comes out of this regional project. It led beside this kind of attention, this kind of film, to now new kind of projects on this kind of fusion of agriculture with buildings as such, with mixing. I'm not going to show that tonight. There are two examples now under construction. There are 2- and 3-story high, so not that high as this, but in order to understand what kind of technologies are there in the southern part of the Netherlands, we are advising them. There's one in China under construction on base of this study for 6 stories high, and there's a new kind of kolkhozes are now set up in the pig industry in order to activate the communal slaughterhouses and hygienic kitchens for it. So that in short the relevance of this kind of studies. And some of you might say, okay, this is far on the distance of architecture, but maybe architecture needs to have this kind of messages, this kind of relationship, in order to innovate itself, in order to find out new liaisons, and in order to make it, to give it again a kind of iconic potential, and to activate as a messenger between the elite here sitting and clustered around, and say there's an enormous amount of people that are not taking part of this kind of enterprises. How to bring that again one step further? How to make regions then again, or let's say how to balance between, as this project showed before, between kind of local momentums and global directions, global pressures even, as you can see now so strongly in Europe, and local resistances, or vice versa, local pressures which can activate maybe global resistances as well, as we have seen currently in Austria and in the Netherlands. So how to deal with that? So we set up a series of studies to do that. We started with some observations on globalism. There are a lot of them, and I give you 2 simple examples. One is on the hypothesis that migration will be there because of demographic and economical reasons, and maybe cultural reasons. So it's based upon the kind of notion, this is done by students of Berlage, that our world has and we know that so much that there is a huge difference in richness and between first, second and third world. And that's enormously increasing the last decades to a momentum, and we are all witnessing it at the very moment, to maybe a sincere crisis or anyway a possible collapse. So how do we deal with that? Can we make environments that maybe go in that direction, that maybe can accommodate a bigger amount of people in certain cases? What kind of architecture, what kind of urban programs should we then imagine? Migration becomes a sincere topic. But what would happen? Can we expect a kind of series of hypotheses on that? And this is I love this one because it's a very simple one, but with an enormous impact in this case on the Netherlands, for instance. So let's make a simple equation. Let's say that everyone gets the same amount of money in the nearby future. The US has $36,000 GDP per capita, China 1/10, Sierra Leone almost nothing. So the average of the world is about $7,500. Let's say the same amount of people. At that moment you could say, okay, the US adopts more It could be inhabited with 1.4 billion inhabitants. China actually would keep more or less, would go down a little bit, and Sierra Leone would cease to exist at that moment. So if we do that, and these are the current densities on a world map projected. There's a cluster there and an interesting cluster over there. So imagine this equilibration, and imagine that they would go to the sources in this period. Then the world would change, maybe beautifully, but radically. But it would cause an enormous density, both in Asia, in the US, and actually most in Europe. When this is the current map, the detail of the world, Africa here and Europe over there, with the Netherlands still on top, with 384 inhabitants per square kilometers. So it would change to this. Almost nothing here, and the Netherlands would get 4 or 5 times as much people, like Britain, actually. So 56 million inhabitants. So we would have conquered Germany at that moment, finally. Where actually 71% would be immigrants, and probably 10 million, 1/5, comes from India. Because they would migrate, much, quite a lot. There's 1/4 would do that in this search for equilibrium, which would cause a total other kind of environment, which would would change our demography, would change our cities more radically and drastically than we now already assume, and would demand for a production and a kind of architectural production which is totally different. Second example on this element, ecological footprint. We know that as well. This is the amount surface of the planet, not everything we can use. This is the amount of land, and of those land actually there's quite a lot already dedicated to forest or to arable land or to permanent pasture as such. So there's actually then 10 billion hectares of productive land for 6 billion people. Is that enough? We know what an ecological footprint is. It includes all the services you need per person and some formulas you need in order to make it comparable. For the current situation, or the biocapacity of the Earth, current situation, current amount of ground, 1.9 hectares per person is the biocapacity. But already we need more. Our consumption pattern needs 1/3 extra. And if you look into the globe, and this is the optimal, there are definitely certain countries which are not fulfilling their task if we go for the average. And some countries need giant amount of land in order to fulfill this equation. So if every country could solve that, then this would be the world. The US would have 4 floors and Europe would have like 3.5 floors. But what happens if everyone, because as given our current setup, if everyone wants to be American, or anyway wants to consume in that way, not counting on a doubling of the population yet. What would happen then already is striking, because we need more or less 4.3 Earths in order to, that gives work for us. So that's a strong topic, what can we do with it? Or we change our lifestyle, or we need more land. 2 global issues, and there are far more, which will find their position in the nearby future, which we have to study in a way and to show the effect on this new puzzle, this new composition that Europe will be. And at the moment, we just opened a show with a book in Düsseldorf on the Ruhrgebiet. The Ruhrgebiet? Where is that? This is the Ruhrgebiet. Quite a nice painting of somewhere in Europe. And Europe is almost turning into a kind of giant middle land, a core which has more inhabitants than the 3 known capitals of Europe, London, Paris and Berlin. This in between is denser than these metropolis. But there's no image about it. Everywhere it looks the same, from the Randstad up to the Swiss Middelland, from Lille to almost East Germany. You have an average density of the sameness. What are we going to do with this? How are we going to reorganize our environment that has become from a kind of competitive field into a collaborative field due to the fact that this area becomes older and older, due to the fact that a lot of the industry has moved away and is going to move away to zones in the world, to Asia or to Africa, where it's more productive and cheaper, due to the fact that there is, one could say, there's an enormous expensive land, the number of highways, the number of infrastructure is hard already to deal with and hard to pay in the near future. So what shall we do with it? How can we give proposals for it? We decided, because we are outsiders, not to make one proposal for Düsseldorf or for the Rhine-Ruhr city. We say we use the money and we use the attention to work on a similar project as the function maker, the region maker as such. And I want to stress for tonight, say the comparison between that, in order to activate the two scales in between. You could see regions as spatial things with a core, and more cores, and a boundary. These boundaries overlap, because for certain products you need to go further away in order that you can get closer by. So region in that way is a sequential series of overlapping of boundaries. And there is a relationship between those regions. There's a series of trade between them which cause different kind of, say, connections between the two. One could say as well that when one becomes smaller, the other becomes bigger, as such. Or there are even pretty linear relationships, according to economists, between the regions as such. Shrink and growth go together hand in hand in that way. And that makes it applicable in models, therefore, to work with it. This is the structure of the program. It is based on total GIS information. You can position yourself in series of coordinates. You can define the region, or it is defined according to the current laws, as I explained before. It has certain kind of content, say program, over there. So many people live there, so many birds are there, so many objects or unit types. There is a series of, say, laws that surround these elements. It can be economical laws, it can be tax laws, it can be political laws in that way. And these could be connected, or these could be validated or evaluated through this kind of sliders, this kind of settings. Yeah, so light issues here, the Dutch are in the middle maybe, and the Danish are there, and the British are somewhere there. And that could lead to a visualization program and even an evaluation program. This, I would say, this is a kind of general structure for this kind of devices that could obtain knowledge, can enlarge knowledge, and it can at every moment can be enlarged, reduced, or accommodated. That can store, and that can therefore and can produce. So this is the starting point of that. It observes the ground, the usage of ground on more levels, local, regional, up to global, interconnected in a kind of sorting system, pixelated on in different ways in order to find out where thresholds between scales should be, say, positioned and calculated, therefore. And with a kind of very hierarchic system between global and local, how, say, information and combinations of information could be, say, positioned. So let me bring you through this program for a certain moment. Stars, you can define your envelope in that way, or in that way. The chooser for the level. It loads down at that moment the information. It will show that in different, say, components will come to you. You can go into deeper into it. This is the GIS maps, which are at that moment pixelated in order to give it a better translation and a more workable, say, screen as such. This is your region. Here you can start to work with it. In the help desk, you find out how the layers are described, how they are grouped, where the thresholds are, and it can you can connect it at that moment with different levels of say of that information. These different pixelations can be directly on the screen. More screens can be opened. Current data can be suggested. The land use chart, quite an important one, and the kind of images, satellite images or helicopter views could be suggested. You can add unit types in order to detail your information and show it directly in this perspective viewer and combine it with its geodata controller so that you know where you position it or where it is positioned at that very moment. It will give maps at that moment on different categories, and it can be linked to other maps, other zones that have on a sets of parameter. It has similarities, but differences as well. It can be shown immediately how that will look. That's Barcelona, that's our city. And it can be selected further in this kind of, say, overviews. These regions can be, say, scored, and the scores can be visualized. Meaning there is more information added than only, say, one topic at that moment for it. We could say every subject or every region gets a kind of performance chart in order to show its characteristics at the moment and how it can. At that moment, alarms are suggested in the programs. In the rural area, there's a certain level of unemployment over there. The unemployment can be, say, analyzed according to the constraints, and flowcharts can be suggested how to work with that, how to treat that. These are based on say, hierarchic systems, interconnected at certain moments, in order to accommodate possible, say, suggestions. Here you can modify those charts. See how it's working and leading to this kind of elements. And at that moment, you can compare the scores of different, say, flowcharts, different scenarios, based on that kind of parameters. Could lead to this kind of cities. I'll give you two examples in order to. One alert in the Rhine city is that the unemployment is, especially of certain types of people, is too high. It's about 15 to 16% at the moment. It's almost equating East Germany. So what to do with that? Accepting it or not? Can we imagine then a kind of trajectory through migration? I combine just for the moment former elements, and if we keep it within the European regions and we start to calculate a new equation of this zone in connection to this frame, if you make the frame bigger, then you get another kind of composition that's clear. It means that during the process, the pixelation, the region makers start to show how much black land there will be, or the computer indicates there's an excess of unused land. And you could suggest, therefore, certain kind of new efficiencies. When you look to the land use chart, you see a lot of blackness, a lot of greenness, that could advocate, when you compare it again to other regions, a certain specialization. Namely, in this case, it could mean that the Central Park, in combination with a kind of special usage for water sources and the Kyoto aspirations, it could lead to maybe a better forest It means that certain zones, and if you want to make a forest, you have to, it loads down at that moment what is a good size for the forest before it starts to suggest what this kind of city could look like. This could be then the new Rhine city, the Detroit of Europe, or the Central Park, accepting that we should not stay there if it's not going right. But let's then invest in Spain or in Italy instead of doing it over there. Let's now leave that country and turn it into a kind of central zone, kind of low density with an enormous potential on the level of green. So you see how for this region we filmed in that way everything, and how at that moment we started to show what it could look like, this nice Duisburg. Another equation, a kind of network city. Another alternative could be there. I'm not judging yet what is the best. That's what that actually, because we were all almost seen as a kind of technocratics the last 10 years, which are kind of overlooking too much to this environment, and we were suggesting maybe too strongly extreme ideas. We would like to bounce it back in a way by this kind of this kind of entr'acte. Again, what do we do with the labor? Maybe another kind of mobility we can suggest. Maybe the access should be optimized. It finds out that the Rhine city has the densest amount of infrastructure in the almost in the world, but it's underused. So maybe we could do the reverse. We could say it's absorb program and allocate it then in a new way by repositioning it. And you see how it's happening next to the network. It will lead to this kind of chart where actually there will be super concentration next to these highways, next to this infrastructure. This leads to this direct visualization. Click on the computer element, this is what you saw, which will look then suddenly to a city, which to Duisburg, which looks like this, an Asian type of environment versus the kind of Detroit zone of enterprise, and it gives a kind of, at that moment maybe a possibility to an un-German city, but as well to a possibility to overcome collectively, not only on the regional level, but as well on the European level, that current crisis in the central part of Europe. Two examples I gave: function mixer and region maker. In order to address a way to overcome the era of analyzing and to suggest escapes from that. It's clear that that project is not stopped, not finished. It seems as a kind of network of interconnected data and analyzers and makers, which I'm happy at the moment to work on three elements for the coming year, ending more or less in October. The climatizer for the French government, to give an idea on the effect of climatic changes on our cities, but as well to suggest changes interactively with the government or with the idealizer, with the ETH in Zurich, where we, together with Jonas Friedman, for instance, try to analyze different positions in critical architecture, Krier versus Eisenman. How will the world look according to Krier? And to link it in as a kind of mini machines in this kind of environments, in this kind of, and finally, of course, an evaluator, extended evaluator connected with the current systems on artificial intelligence in order to create a system of evaluation, maybe a Darwinistic enterprise of this machinery. And with that suggestion, I hope to give you a kind of small overview of this enterprise that I partly linked with our work, but partly because it's, say, innocence, or as known as need to be investigated next year. Thank you very much for your attention.
I think there's just about enough time for a few questions. But I should have said a couple of things at the beginning, which I forgot, just in case people are leaving. This is going to be quite a busy week in the school. Tomorrow night, there is Mark Dytham, who is a partner in a practice called Klein Dytham from Tokyo, that do a lot of both small-scale exhibitions and buildings, and actually work with a lot of innovative materials. So please try and come. And also on Wednesday night, the Japanese composer Ryoichi Ikeda with Karsten Nikolai are making a performance here. And of course, there's the conference on sport and architecture at the end of the week, which I hope you'll be here. I want to maybe start with one or two questions, or if somebody is volunteering immediately, I'm also happy to pass on to somebody else. But one thing that I wanted to ask you, Winnie, before we go to Julian, is that so much of what you're doing is on this focused on the question of speculations, of what if, and some of it, for example, in terms of the research that you did with the datascapes and the continuation of these things, are often on the kind of borderline of the what if produces certain results, but these results are also experiments that could be, as you suggested, daring speculations that one needs to engage in order to find out whether they bear fruit, whether they are actually productive. They could also be somehow completely wacko, in terms of where they go. And what you don't seem to present is the mechanism of testing in your work. How do you cross this, how do you negotiate this boundary between experimentation, which is speculative and productive, and experimentation, which is really something that might be not as productive, let's say, to put it positively.
The wacky parts. The wacky parts.
The wacko, yeah. I mean, in the sense that I think some of the things could be productive, other ones could lead to certain forms of tyranny, you could say. So how do you negotiate between productive speculations and tyranny?
Well, I showed it only maybe too short in the case of the Siludam, that the so-called wacko parts help to say no, or to advocate another direction, therefore. Surprisingly, sometimes the wacko elements are taken over. Like, for instance, a project in Switzerland at the moment. And then one could say that that stresses again, besides that you should do it, I would say, and to come up with a series of alternatives, definitely in the first part of the project as a negotiative tool. But it stresses as well that that is not so clear where things are going to at the moment. That way, so-called weird scenarios, weird what-ifs, seemingly weird what-ifs, are sometimes closer than I expected them to be, which stresses again the need for anyway to do it. What can be seen as well in that kind of game, or that of suggesting over the limit or within the limits, is that certain clients become as well bored in a way. They expect from us in that case, such a kind of exuberance that we sometimes cannot fulfill even at this moment. That in certain cases the world is more crazy than my generation has imagined. So that's fine. I think that would be that's at that moment that deserves wider investigation, more participants, newer generations to test it, to be against it, or to extend it. and to compare those elements. So so there is not a clear, say, strategy at the moment for your suggestion how much wacko or not the studies should be.
No, it seems to me that, for example, some of the projects, let's say when you're dealing with the ROE or when you were dealing with the 3D city, they also begin to touch on certain lineages of architecture. I mean, let's say in respect to Broadacre City, say, in terms of the notions of dispersion and so on. And I wonder at what point you might consider these kinds of histories as part of what you are making, because it's quite clear that when you're making a project, it's quite important that you don't always start with a historical project. That can be terribly kind of limiting. So you're starting with something which is like a fresh palette, and that openness is very important, not to be limited by the previous history of what has existed. But you arrive then at a point where the project, in terms of its appearance at least, begins to have certain similarities with Broadacre City, or with the Unité in terms of the earlier example. And you begin to also make certain kind of criticism of these projects. I'm curious to know how you might bring in, or do you at any point bring in, when the thing is so close in some ways to the Unité and yet it isn't, as part of the discussion.
The history has given the architectural domain, of course, an enormous potential, enormous series of studies which are kind of accumulated or are concentrated in certain kind of products, like Broadacre or like Archizoom or like and they deserve attention clearly because they become iconic, and they sometimes appear within the constraints which are still there. That's a bit the contradiction, I would say, how to escape this kind of prototypes as maybe discovered by Le Corbusier or others. But at certain moments, within certain constraints, like for instance in the Silodam, given the amount of constraints which were there, then the Unité became a reference as such. And but for us at that moment, those studies needed to be reapplied in a way. Because they deal, I mean, the objects or the elements we are now suggesting, and I'm not referring that way to Piranesi as such. Piranesi can only refer to in a kind of aesthetical or spatial way. 3D City is referring to that on that level, one could say. But this project are kind of referring to an epoch, indeed the 60s or 50s, where research was more accommodated by architects, where large scale could be suggested, and which in the end lead to a kind of crisis, so that could as well be criticized. So they deserve enormously at the moment that globalism is anyway, for a lot of people there, they should be re-evaluated and tested on its current constraints. Well, what happens if you apply the logic of the Unité in our current environments? What kind of standards should be in? What kind of ecology should be added to that? What kind of access should be added? And it will in that way be look totally different than the one we've seen in France. So indeed, then that you could give it criticism, or you can give it an update.
I'd like to ask the question.
Otherwise I go for the beer.
Well, soon, probably. I know it's a little bit late, but no. Hugo, are you volunteering from the back?
Is Hugo always the one who to bridge the gaps?
Just to do.
Normally it's yearning.
Just to delay having a beer for a little bit longer. Within the 3D city, there's a sense, as in some of the other work as well, that in a way more mix is better. You know, the more you get, the more you can complexify, the more you can fit. And that, I think, raises some questions about what one is trying to achieve in terms of a living place or a place for the future. And there's also a sense that you get locked, so that in a way there's a sense of losing the flexibility of mix. If you get so complex and so highly sort of data-based into a three-dimensional complex. And it reminds me slightly worryingly of Paolo Soleri and of some of the other sort of futuristic attempts to fit everything into the box, which raise then, I think, quite serious social and political questions about what the future of the living space may be in terms of a negotiated space. If everything is actually crammed and can't be, there's no, in a way, no space for future mix. Now, that's perhaps an unjust interpretation of but it comes really more from the drawings than from what you were saying. There's a danger that becomes a sort of icon of a sort of super mix, super complex block. What sort of response do you have to that sort of criticism of the 3D city?
I totally agree with you that this is not, and I said it as well in the lecture, not meant to be a kind of built structure as well at that moment of this ballet city in that way. It was an exercise. And it's clear, I mean, that therefore the move in a way to this kind of computer programming, for instance, is helpful, but for instance to have phasing or changeability as well incorporated in this kind of studies. Then about maximization, what you suggest that you could be claustrophobic and not helpful, I agree as well, but maximization is about limits still, so that's it's in that way a study which can reveal that momentum that this kind of counter suggestions, as you suggest as well, can be explored, or can be anyway can be notated, can be indicated, and can be therefore expressed. And so without, I mean, it's a technique which comes out of natural science in a way, where maximization pressure on rats, for instance, helps to give a certain kind of knowledge on their social behavior or on diseases. So one should not follow it further than that. In a way that it advocates therefore knowledge and advocates therefore maybe progress, because you can judge then that knowledge if it's good, bad, or not bad, or when you connect it to other parameters, if that's the good direction to go to.
But does your work with the 50 mayors, was it 50, or the mayors of all the different local regions, does that lead you also to think that there may need to be, in a way, a rethinking of the processes of negotiation, the political processes, in order to allow the sort of tools that you're working with to really generate something productive, rather than something that could be quite negative in terms of being controlled by certain blocks of interests without the flexibility that is actually implicit in them?
Well, it's clear that negotiation, because it's under study here at the AA, of course, enormously as well. It becomes almost a fashionable word, but it's that architects can help to visualize and therefore can help the negotiation by counteracts, by in that way the clearest example is the big city. I'm wondered by the kind of the enormous amount of attention, and therefore negotiation after us came out of that, including the strong decisions or discussions after the murder of Pim Fortuyn. So that made it, that seems that architecture can become a political instrument in that field of negotiations. So that's, one could say that one could wonder if you should be happy with it. And I had a strong discussion with certain American criticisms and critics who were, and you could see that the US has no political architecture at the moment. There is, it is only about form and fear, therefore. One could even say that at the moment that you want to be strong, that they are very feared for their own health at the moment, their own next commission. So it deserves attention at the moment, that kind of, that kind of role of architecture, and that maybe that courage that certain people are taking, are positioning itself. Because at that moment, we were criticized that we were not, in our data escape analysis, not ideological. And maybe that has been transferred lately by kind of clear ideologies sometimes, or by extremized ideologies, that ideologies need, and again maybe find a place in work. I mean, there are of course a lot of ways of dealing with it, and this is one of them. And no, that stresses that combination of ideology and extremization maybe, or visualization, that could help again in the political debate. Yeah?
No, you wait for a microphone. There's another one, I think, coming. Don't we have one?
The acoustics are good.
Yes, the people upstairs.
Oh yeah.
I was quite interested in your regional study, where you actually proposed that Europe comes closer together, and therefore there are certain regional clusters for industries. But I'm actually wondering how that could incorporate sort of changes within the industries, because if you think of certain industries that have peaks and lows, that would make one region completely dependent on one industry. And therefore I'm wondering how that region could cope with a sort of fluctuation.
Well, these processes take between 20 and 25 years. In order to, so that gives already time for change. That's quite a, of course, that's connected with real estate value, with market systems. So that makes change possible. Don't be afraid of that. That's what I would say. And that will come, and actually the recent history has shown that very clearly in the Ruhrgebiet or in other industrial areas, how rapid that actually moves, even this last decade, how headquarters are almost not in Europe anymore, and how they move or are connected with their industries in Asia again, or in India. So one could wonder in that way if one could design a kind of flexible industrial approach. That's what I could read in you, because yeah, it's quite heavy. You have to invest in it. These investments take more or less. Actually, it costs 40 years, but it pays off only 25 years at the moment. So it deserves a certain kind of flexibility. I don't know yet how. I don't. We didn't work on it too much, or we haven't. And it's. But it's. When you look now to the current, say, our current landscapes or cityscapes, all this enormous amount of sheds, which are very flexible. They're cheap, and you can bring them down easily. But we are surrounded with an enormous level of constraints, because we are not allowed to build more than 40% of the Netherlands, or in Germany you're not allowed to build because of the contour lines of these hidden industries and these barracks as such. So it stresses in combination with this enormous tendency to go away, to find, let's say, technologies, and to find legal structures that allow for changes in this coming 25 years. And yeah, that's what I could say for the moment about it. Further is, I'm not so connected yet with it.
I think maybe this is a good moment for that
Okay.
beer.
Any last question? Otherwise we go to the beer.
I just want to thank you. I think that it's probably worth reiterating what you're saying about the fact that these researches, in a way, do need to be open-ended, and I'm sure everybody here would agree with you that we need to kind of take those risks. So I hope you come back, as you promised, next year and show us where that project of 2003 has gone.
Okay.
And we'll see. Thank you. Because I think that it's sort of like, it's the sort of thing that you have to do this and then you have to sit down and really talk for a couple of hours in a smaller group, because the topics Like for example, you go into immigration, and then from immigration, and then from immigration,
Yes, you. Sorry, I was not in crowd.
That you're bad. That was
I
bad.
echoed it today.
Where's Fluffy?
He's sitting here. Sitting in the back. So you're feeling the best. You got all sparkling. I'm just going to get my
I'm
bag.
coughing. I mean, it's
And then we
still.
will go very quickly.
I've been putting